Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Backlog Bunker. This week I want to start off by talking about Final Fantasy VII Remake. Honestly, I started Remake before I recorded last week's Bunker, but I wanted that one to be shorter and a little bit more focused, so I left it out of that week's discussion. But I'm kind of glad that I did anyway, because the vast substance of what I actually want to talk about has to do with the materia system, which I didn't get more experience with until now. One of the few things that I praised about Final Fantasy VII was the materia system, because it gets you to engage with the magic system and the equipment system by asking you more than just what does the biggest numbers. You're encouraged to constantly swap things out and make sure you're getting good levels for the materia that you're using. But even then, the problem that I had with materia was that it kind of made every character the same. Since everyone can equip a healing materia, then everyone's a healer. But in Remake, since everyone plays differently just by nature of it being an action game, then swapping out materia whenever you want feels way more freeing. Yeah, fuck it, I'll just give Barret a bunch of spells. He's just gonna be my stagger bait anyway, because Barret is by far the least interesting character to play. And then in terms of some of the more minor things, the game is going to spoil me with the fast forwarding. I started playing Yakuza 8, right after I started Remake, and every time the cutscene was moving just a little bit too slow for me, I started pressing the right trigger, even though it does not work in that game, because that was a thing that Final Fantasy VII Remake invented. Well, I don't know about invented, but it's the game that's gotten me used to it, so until it's become not a habit for me, I'm gonna be hammering that right trigger, while I ponder to myself why literally every game doesn't have this. And finally, given a lot of the expanded scope and spectacle of Remake, I can see why people wanted a remake of 7 so badly. It didn't really occur to me until someone had pointed it out, but Final Fantasy VII has aged the worst visually of any Final Fantasy game. The classic games 1 to 6 are all pixel art, 8 and 9 are vast improvements on the PlayStation technology, and then 10 and everything else after that is PS2 and beyond, and those games just age better. 7 is the only one that does weird things like use amputee chibis as the overworld models. So I'm glad the gamers are finally getting a faithful remake of this beloved RPG classic. No, I haven't finished the story yet, which is unrelated, I just felt like pointing that out. Now, as I mentioned before, I did start playing Yakuza 8, right after this, and all the things I have to say about it are really short, but really praiseworthy, really. So all those Yakuza fans who mysteriously went silent after I praised 7 can continue to not give me shit. So the big three in terms of praise for Yakuza 8 are you get MP back from all basic attacks, not just for certain classes, you have a ring that you can move around in, purposefully, and the positioning of enemy launches actually matter, and you can see them for once. And if you'll remember from my Backlog Bunker on Yakuza 7, these were all things that I mentioned about Yakuza 7 that were criticisms. The movement especially is a criticism I know most people have about Yakuza 7, so if I didn't know any better, I'd almost think that Ryuga Gotoku is learning from their previous games. Which sounds like a silly thing to say, but you have to realize that the most a Yakuza game has ever improved from game to game has been from 5 to 0 by swapping out a billion playable characters with styles, and then from 6 to Kiwami 2 by fixing the heat gauge and heat mode. But even those are a little bit different, because in terms of direct here's the problem, now here's a solution game design, 7 to 8 is unprecedented in the entire series as far as I'm concerned. Admittedly, I didn't play the original 1 and 2, and if there were any gameplay additions made to the remastered versions of 3, 4, and 5, I wouldn't know. I also didn't beat 3 and 5, but as far as I played all of those games, none of my criticisms were ever directly addressed by the next game. Unless you want to count being playable as for addressing 3's problems. And for the last game this week, I've technically been playing it for a while, but I've only just recently gotten back to actually consistently playing it, and that's Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. And to keep things simple, I am not having a lot of fun, because everything takes forever and people take no damage. I don't want to compare the entire game to Fire Emblem Awakening, but when you make something as good as Awakening, everything you ever made before that is going to be compared to it and look like piss in comparison. I really don't have that much to say about Radiant Dawn yet, just that it isn't as mechanically deep as Awakening. I really just wanted to use it as a springboard to mention the fact that this is why I usually play series in release order, aside from the fact that that's just how they were intended to be played. When you play a series in release order, you get to follow its technological advances as it goes on, so you don't end up with problems like playing Awakening next to any other Fire Emblem game, or playing Mega Man 11 and then going back to one of the old ones that had to use passwords. And then finally, for the weekly topic, we return to Marvel Rivals, but only kind of, because again, this is kind of just a springboard game. The Season 2.5 patch seems to want to steer the game away from the dive meta, but is that because dive has taken over the game, or is it because that's not the game the Rivals devs want? Because when you really think about it, doesn't every game kind of settle on a meta? I mean, they have to eventually whenever they stop receiving updates, so why is it that dive is the meta that Rivals absolutely cannot end on? Is there anything necessarily inherently bad with dive that makes it bad for the game? If I'm balancing a fighting game and people keep telling me to buff the grapplers because they keep losing their zoners, the answer is almost always going to be no, because that's an inherent weakness of the character archetypes. If dives keep sneaking into the backline to kill defenseless healers, then yeah, that's just gonna happen, because healers are squishier than other characters. But then some people would argue that no, the game should be built around head-to-head confrontations and not around people sneaking around the back. So what does balance actually mean? Should balance be what the creators of the game expect the game to look like? Like, for example, with Marvel Rivals, if they don't think that the superhero fantasy is heroes diving into the backline to kill healers, then obviously they would balance the game by taking that out. But that would kind of be a hard goal for balancing to reach, because the player base is always developing, and they're always going to find new strategies you just didn't think of. Well, what if we take it more literally? Should balance make the game more fair for everybody? Make it fair and balanced? That's almost even more inconsistent, because again, the player base is always going to be changing, and on top of that, what does making it fair even manifest as for most games? Because remember, in a competitive game, when you're talking about how good a character is, you're not just talking about their tools, you're talking about how they use those tools on other characters. When talking about Super Smash Bros. Brawl, we're talking about Meta Knight, and every character is judged based on how well they can fight Meta Knight, because there's Meta Knight and there's everybody else. But how would you even go about balancing that game? Because if you buffed everybody, then that would just make Meta Knight the worst character in the game. Point being, when you try to balance the game around every character being equal, it's just never going to work out. The closest you can even kind of get to that is a Dragon Ball Fire situation during some of its seasons, where the characters were so homogenized that, for the most part, you could pick any character and do fairly well, but even that game still had its obvious high tiers. I'm sure I'll come back to this topic at some point in the future. I just wanted to mention it now because people seem to be very worried about Marvel Rivals Season 2.5, and I figured now is a good time to talk about what I think balance even means, or what the goal of it should be. But that's it for this week. Get out of here.